They said Magnolia Maggie Slade had a demon's heart wrapped in an angel's face, that she'd rather slit a man's throat than let him kiss her hand. For 23 years, no man in all of Texas territory had been wild enough to claim her. But when a Comanche war chief with blood-stained hands and eyes like winter storms rode into Fort Defiance, everything the frontier knew about untamable women was about to change forever. The August sun blazed merciless over Fort Defiance, turning the dusty parade ground into a furnace that could cook a man alive in his own skin. But Magnolia Slade stood in the center of that inferno like she was born from flame itself, her auburn hair whipping in the desert wind, her emerald eyes fixed on the 6 men who thought they could break her spirit. She held the Colt .45 like it was an extension of her soul, the weight of it familiar as breathing.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
Around the makeshift shooting range, soldiers and settlers had gathered to watch what they'd come to call the Devil's Dance, another fool's attempt to prove he could tame the untamable daughter of Colonel Samuel Slade. Lieutenant James Morrison stepped forward, his uniform crisp despite the heat, his smile cocky as a rooster in a henhouse. He was new to Fort Defiance, fresh from West Point, and hadn't yet learned why the other officers referred to Maggie as the Colonel's Storm behind closed doors. "Miss Slade," Morrison drawled, tipping his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "Surely a lady of your refinement would prefer needlework to gunplay?" Maggie's laugh was sharp as broken glass. "Lieutenant, the day I choose embroidery over artillery is the day hell freezes over and the devil takes up ice skating." The crowd chuckled nervously. They'd heard variations of this dance before. Magnolia Slade had been rejecting suitors since she was 16, each rejection more spectacular than the last. There was the banker's son from Austin who'd challenged her to a horse race and ended up eating dust for 3 miles. The cattle baron from San Antonio who'd tried to grab her waist during a dance and found himself on his back with her boot on his throat. The preacher's nephew who'd suggested she'd make a fine wife if she could just learn to hold her tongue. He'd walked away with a black eye and a vocabulary of curse words that would make a sailor blush. "Perhaps," Morrison continued, clearly enjoying what he thought was his moment of triumph, "we could make this interesting. If I outshoot you, you'll allow me to escort you to the harvest dance next week." Maggie's eyes narrowed to emerald slits. "And if I outshoot you?" Morrison's grin widened. "Then I'll publicly apologize for underestimating your unique talents." What Morrison didn't know, what none of the men who'd tried to court Maggie understood, was that Colonel Samuel Slade hadn't raised a daughter. He'd raised a warrior. From the time she could hold a rifle, Maggie had been trained not in the gentle arts expected of frontier ladies, but in the brutal skills needed to survive in a land where death rode over every horizon. Her mother, Catherine Slade, had died when Comanche raiders attacked a supply wagon when Maggie was 8. Instead of sending his daughter back east to be civilized by relatives, the colonel had chosen a different path. If the frontier was going to take everything he loved, then by God, he'd make sure his daughter could take it right back. Maggie raised her colt, and the entire fort went silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. 6 bottles lined the fence. Rail 50 yards away, an impossible shot for most men. Child's play for the woman they called too fierce to love. The first shot exploded like thunder. Glass scattered like diamond rain. The second shot followed before the echo of the first had died. Then the third, fourth, fifth, and sixth in rapid succession, each bullet finding its mark with surgical precision. When the smoke cleared, 6 bottlenecks stood on the rail like broken teeth, and Lieutenant Morrison's face had gone white as bleached bone. "Well, Lieutenant," Maggie said, spinning her colt before sliding it back into her holster with fluid grace, "I believe you have an apology to make." But before Morrison could speak, a new sound cut through the desert air, the thunder of approaching. Hooves coming fast and hard from the eastern ridge. The dust cloud appeared first, rolling across the horizon like a brown wave. Then came the riders, 20 Comanche warriors painted for war, their ponies lathered with sweat and foam. At their head rode a man who seemed carved from the desert itself, his bronze skin marked with scars that told stories of 100 battles. The fort's alarm bell clanged to life, and soldiers scrambled for their weapons. But Colonel Slade emerged from his office with his hand raised, signaling his men to hold their fire. This wasn't a raid. This was something else entirely. "Stand down," the colonel shouted. "Let them approach." The Comanche war party thundered through the fort's open gates, their ponies snorting and dancing with barely contained energy. The leader dismounted with the fluid grace of a predator, his obsidian eyes scanning the assembled crowd until they found what they were looking for. They found Maggie. She stood frozen in place, her hand instinctively moving toward her pistol. But something in the warrior's gaze stopped her cold. He was tall for a Comanche, with shoulders broad as an axe handle and hands that looked like they could crush stone. War paint streaked his cheeks in patterns that spoke of death and victory, and a necklace of bare claws hung across his chest, like a declaration of war against the world itself. But it was his eyes that held her captive, dark as winter nights, old as the mountains, and filled with a terrible intelligence that seemed to see straight through her carefully constructed armor to the wild heart beating beneath. "I am Kestrel who hunts storms," he said in English that carried only the faintest trace of accent. His voice was deep as thunder, smooth as whiskey, dangerous as a loaded gun. "War chief of the Antelope Band. I have come to speak with the one they call the Stormbringer." Every eye in the fort turned to Maggie. The Stormbringer. It was what the Comanche called her, a name that had spread across the plains faster than wildfire. Stories of the white woman who could outride the wind, outshoot the eagles, and whose fury in battle was like witnessing the wrath of the sky gods themselves. But how did this warrior know that name? And why had he come alone to a fort filled with his enemies? Colonel Slade stepped forward, his hand resting on his saber. "State your business, Chief. This is neutral ground, but my patience has limits." Kestrel's gaze never left Maggie's face. "I have not come to speak with you, Colonel. I have come for her." The words sent a chill through the assembled crowd that had nothing to do with the desert wind. Maggie felt her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird, but she forced herself to step forward, her chin raised in defiance. "I'm right here," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos raging in her chest. "Speak your piece." Kestrel studied her for a long moment, taking in the gun at her hip, the steel in her spine, the fire burning behind her green eyes. When he smiled, it was like watching lightning split the sky. "You have killed 17 of my warriors," he said conversationally, as if discussing the weather. The statement hit the crowd like a thunderclap. 17 warriors. Maggie's raids on Comanche camps had been the stuff of legend, stories told around campfires about the woman who rode like a demon and fought like an angel of vengeance. But no one had ever tallied the exact count. 18, actually, Maggie corrected, her voice cool as mountain snow. "You missed the one at Bitter Creek last spring." Kestrel's smile widened, showing teeth white as bone. "Ah yes, young Spotted Horse. He spoke of you before he died. Sard, you fought like a she-wolf protecting her cubs. He shouldn't have been raiding settlers' wagons. And you should not have been hunting my people like animals." Kestrel took a step closer, and Maggie caught the scent of him, leather and sage, smoke and something wild that made her pulse quicken despite herself. Yet here we both are. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Soldiers fingered their weapons, settlers backed toward the buildings, and somewhere in the crowd, a woman whispered a prayer. "So what now?" Maggie asked. "You going to challenge me to single combat? Try to avenge your fallen warriors?" Kestrel threw back his head and laughed, a sound like rolling thunder that echoed off the fort's walls.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
Challenge you, no Stormbringer, I have come to claim you. The words hung in the superheated air like a curse spoken in a sacred place. Claim her, as if Maggie Slade were a prize to be won, a territory to be conquered. The audacity of it should have enraged her. Instead, she found herself fascinated by the sheer impossibility of what this Comanche war chief was suggesting. Claim me? Maggie's voice was deadly quiet. I'm not a horse to be broken or land to be settled, Chief. No, Kestrel agreed, his dark eyes never leaving hers. You are something far more dangerous. You are a woman who has forgotten she is a woman. The insult hit like a physical blow, and Maggie's hand dropped to her gun. Around them, the crowd took a collective step back, sensing the violence that crackled between the two figures like electricity before a storm. But Kestrel made no move for his own weapons. Instead, he continued speaking in that maddeningly calm voice. For 7 seasons, you have ridden the warpath. 7 seasons of blood and death and vengeance. Tell me, Stormbringer, when did you last feel alive instead of angry? The question caught Maggie off guard. When had she last felt truly alive? She couldn't remember. Her days had become an endless cycle of training, fighting, and trying to fill the hollow space inside her chest where something vital had been carved out the day her mother died. My feelings are none of your concern, she said, but even to her own ears, the words sounded hollow. Kestrel nodded as if she'd confirmed something he already knew. You are dying inside that warrior's skin, and everyone here is too afraid of you to tell you the truth. And what truth is that? That you were not born to be a killer, you were born to be a queen. The word struck Maggie like lightning. Queen, not lady, not wife, not any of the diminished roles that white society offered women. Queen, with all the power and sovereignty that implied. Colonel Slade finally found his voice. Now see here, Chief. My daughter is not some prize to be claimed by any savage who... Careful, Colonel. Kestrel's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried across the entire parade ground. I have come in peace, but peace is a fragile thing. The threat was unmistakable, and Colonel Slade's hand tightened on his saber. Behind him, his soldiers shifted nervously, outnumbered by the Comanche warriors who sat their horses like statues, waiting for their chief's command. But it was Maggie who broke the deadly silence. You still haven't told me what you want. Kestrel turned back to her, and for a moment, his warrior's mask slipped. Underneath the war paint and scars, Maggie glimpsed something unexpected, loneliness as deep and vast as the desert itself. I want you to ride with me, he said simply. Not as my captive, not as my woman, but as my equal. I want to show you what you could become if you stopped fighting the world and started fighting for something worth dying for. And what would that be? Freedom. The word hung between them like a bridge spanning an impossible chasm. Freedom, not the hollow independence Maggie had carved out for herself at Fort Defiance, but something larger, wilder, more dangerous than anything she'd ever imagined. You're insane, she whispered. Kestrel's smile was sharp as a blade. So, are you? That's why this might work. Before Maggie could respond, Lieutenant Morrison stepped forward, his face flushed with outrage and embarrassment. Miss Slade, surely you're not considering this savage's ridiculous proposal. The word savage cut through the air like a whip crack, and suddenly every Comanche warrior was reaching for his weapons. The moment balanced on a knife's edge, death hovering like a vulture overhead. But Kestrel simply turned to Morrison, with that terrible smile still playing around his lips. Lieutenant, is it? Tell me, what do you know of Savage? Morrison straightened, trying to project confidence he clearly didn't feel. I know enough to recognize a threat when I see one. Do you? Kestrel's voice was soft as silk, deadly as poison. Because I see a boy playing soldier, trying to claim a woman who would eat him alive before breakfast." The challenge was unmistakable, and Morrison's hand dropped to his pistol. "How dare you?" He never finished the sentence. Kestrel moved like striking lightning, covering the distance between them in 3 fluid strides. His hand closed around Morrison's throat, lifting the lieutenant off his feet with casual strength that spoke of muscles forged in warfare and hardened by survival. "The dare," Kestrel said conversationally, "is yours to make." Morrison's face turned purple as he clawed at the iron grip around his windpipe. Around them, soldiers raised their rifles, but none dared fire with their officer held as a human shield. "Let him go." Maggie's voice cut through the chaos like a blade through silk. Now, Kestrel's eyes found hers across the deadly tableau. For a heartbeat that lasted forever, they stared at each other, predator to predator, warrior to warrior, 2 souls recognizing something wild and untamable in each other. Then Kestrel opened his hand, and Morrison collapsed to the dust, gasping and retching. "As you wish," Kestrel said, never taking his eyes off Maggie. "I am, after all, a guest in your home." The mockery in his voice was gentle, almost tender, and somehow that made it more dangerous than any threat. He was playing with them all, demonstrating his power while maintaining the fiction of diplomacy. Maggie stepped forward, putting herself between Kestrel and the gasping Morrison. "You've made your point, Chief. State your terms." "Terms?" Kestrel tilted his head like a wolf hearing distant prey. "This is not a negotiation, Stormbringer. This is an invitation. To what? To remember who you were before they taught you. To be afraid of your own power." The words hit Maggie like physical blows, each one finding a weakness in her carefully constructed armor. Before they taught you to be afraid. But who was they? Her father, with his rigid military discipline? The society that demanded she choose between being a woman or being strong? Or herself, building walls so high that she'd forgotten what it felt like to be human? "I'm not afraid of anything," she said. But the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. Kestrel's smile was sad and knowing. "No? Then prove it. Ride with me for 1 day. Let me show you the world beyond these walls. If you choose to return, I will never trouble you again. And if I don't return, then you will have found what you were truly meant to be." The challenge hung in the desert air like smoke from a signal fire. Around them, the crowd held its collective breath, waiting to see how the legend of Maggie Slade would end, or if it would simply transform into something altogether more dangerous. Colonel Slade stepped forward, his face gray with fear and fury. "Magnolia, you will not seriously consider this madness." But Maggie wasn't looking at her father. She was staring into the obsidian depths of Kestrel's eyes, seeing her own reflection staring back, wild, fierce, and utterly alone. For 23 years she had been the untamable daughter of Fort Defiance. For 7 years she had been the Stormbringer, angel of vengeance on the Texas plains. But who was she really? And what would she become if she had the courage to find out? The sun blazed overhead like the eye of an angry god, and in the distance, thunder rumbled across the endless sky. A storm was coming. Maggie could feel it in her bones, taste it in the electric air. The only question was whether she would watch it from behind the safety of the fort's walls, or ride out to meet it like the warrior she'd always claimed to be. Kestrel extended his hand, palm up, fingers steady as stone. An invitation, a challenge, a doorway to a destiny she'd never dared imagine. The choice was hers, and hers alone. The first raindrop hit the dust at Maggie's feet like a bullet, sending up a tiny puff of earth that somehow seemed to echo across the deadly silence of Fort Defiance. She stared at Kestrel's outstretched hand, her mind racing through calculations that had nothing to do with survival and everything to do with the strange hunger gnawing at her chest. "Magnolia!" Colonel Slade's voice cracked like a whip. "Step away from that savage, now." But Maggie didn't move. Couldn't move. Because for the first time in 7 years of killing and fighting and proving herself stronger than any man who dared challenge her, she was face to face with someone who looked at her like she was exactly what she was supposed to be. The rain began falling harder, turning the dust to mud, plastering her auburn hair to her face. Around them, soldiers raised their rifles higher, fingers hovering over triggers, waiting for their colonel's order to turn this tense standoff into a massacre. "One day," Kestrel said, his voice somehow carrying over the sound of rain drumming, "on wooden buildings. Ride with me until the sun sets tomorrow. If you choose to return, you have my word as a war chief that no harm will come to your fort or your people. And if she doesn't return?" Colonel Slade demanded, his hand white-knuckled on his saber hilt. Kestrel's smile was sharp as winter wind. "Then she was never yours to keep." The words hit Maggie like lightning. Never yours to keep, as if her entire life at Fort Defiance had been a kind of elaborate captivity, gilded with duty and honor, but captivity nonetheless. The thought should have enraged her. Instead, it felt like a key turning in a lock she hadn't even realized existed. "I'll go," she said quietly. The words fell into the rain-soaked silence like stones into deep water, sending ripples of shock through the assembled crowd. Lieutenant Morrison, still massaging his bruised throat, stared at her with undisguised horror. The soldiers exchanged nervous glances. Even the Comanche warriors seemed surprised by her quick decision, but Colonel Slade looked like he'd been shot through the heart. "Magnolia, no, I forbid it." Maggie turned to face her father, and for the first time in her life, she saw him clearly, not as the towering figure of authority who had shaped her into a weapon, but as a man whose love had become a cage and whose protection had become a prison. "You can't forbid me anything anymore, Papa," she said gently. "I'm 23 years old, and I've been making my own choices for a long time." "Choices?" Colonel Slade's voice rose to a roar that competed with the thunder overhead. "You call this madness a choice? You're talking about riding off with hostiles. With murderers, with the enemy you trained me to fight," Maggie finished. "Maybe it's time I learned why we're fighting in the first place." She walked to Kestrel, her boots squelching in the muddy ground, and placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers with surprising gentleness, warm and calloused and steady as stone. "I need an hour to prepare," she said. Kestrel nodded. "We will wait." As if his words were a signal, the Comanche warriors dismounted in perfect unison, leading their horses to shelter under the fort's overhangs. They moved with fluid precision, like water finding its natural course, and suddenly Fort Defiance was occupied by 20 armed enemies who acted like they owned the place. The soldiers didn't know whether to arrest them, shoot them, or offer them coffee. Maggie's quarters were sparse as a monk's cell, a narrow cot, a wooden chest for her. Few belongings, a washstand with a cracked mirror that reflected her face in fractured pieces. She moved through the familiar space like a sleepwalker, gathering the essentials for a journey she couldn't begin to imagine. Her hands shook as she packed her saddlebags. Not from fear, but from something that felt dangerously like excitement. When had she last felt excited about anything? When had her pulse last quickened for reasons that had nothing to do with violence or danger? A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "Come in." She expected her father, but it was Sergeant Major O'Malley who stepped through the door. O'Malley had been at Fort Defiance longer than anyone, a grizzled Irishman who'd fought in more battles than he could count and who'd helped train Maggie since she was old enough to hold a rifle. "Lass," he said quietly, closing the door behind him. "What in blazes are ye thinking?" Maggie continued packing, not trusting herself to meet his eyes. "I'm thinking it's time I learned something besides how to kill, Sergeant." O'Malley was quiet. For a long moment, studying her with eyes that had seen too much death and too little hope. Finally, he reached into his coat and pulled out something wrapped in oiled leather. "Then you'll be needing this," he said, handing her the package. Maggie unwrapped it carefully, gasping when she saw what lay inside. It was her mother's journal, the one Catherine Slade had kept during her years on the frontier, filled with pressed flowers and sketches of the landscape and observations about the Comanche tribe she'd encountered. "I thought Papa burned all." "Her things," Maggie whispered. "He tried to," O'Malley said. "But some things are too precious to burn. Your mother, she didn't see the Comanche as monsters, lass. She saw them as people caught in the same bloody mess as the rest of us." Maggie opened the journal with trembling fingers, reading her mother's careful script. "Today I met a Comanche woman at the trading post. She had the most beautiful child, a little girl with eyes like midnight. We couldn't speak each other's language, but we understood each other perfectly when we talked about our daughters. I gave her one of Maggie's baby shoes, and she gave me a bead from her dress. I think we could have been friends if the world were different. Why are you showing me this?" Maggie asked. O'Malley's weathered face was grim. "Because your father's been carrying a burden of guilt for 15 years, and it's made him see enemies where there might be something else. Your mother died in that raid, true enough. But she died because she was trying to protect a Comanche child who'd been separated from his family." The words hit Maggie like a physical blow. All these years, she'd believed her mother had been murdered by savage raiders. But the truth was more complicated, more human, more heartbreaking. "The boy she died protecting," Maggie said slowly. "What happened to him?" O'Malley's smile was sad as winter rain. "He grew up to be a war chief, I'd imagine. Somewhere out there, probably telling his own stories about the white woman who gave her life to save him." Maggie stared at the journal in her hands, feeling the foundation of her entire worldview shift like sand beneath her feet. Everything she'd believed, everything she'd built her identity around, was suddenly questionable. "Sergeant," she said quietly, "what if I don't come back?" O'Malley studied her for a long moment, then reached out and squeezed her shoulder with a gentleness that reminded her of her father before grief had hardened him into a weapon. "Then I'll pray to find what you're looking for, lass. And I'll pray it's better than what you're leaving behind." The rain had stopped by the time Maggie emerged from her quarters, but the air still crackled with electricity, as if the storm was simply gathering strength for another assault. She led her mare, Temperance, across the muddy parade ground, acutely aware of every eye following her progress. Kestrel stood beside his war pony, checking his weapons with the methodical precision of a man who'd survived countless battles. He looked up as she approached, and something in his expression softened when he saw the saddlebags slung across her horse's flanks. "You came," he said, and there was surprise in his voice, as if he'd expected her to change her mind. "I said I would. Many people say things they do not mean." Maggie swung into her saddle with fluid grace, settling into the familiar leather with the ease of someone who'd been riding since before she could walk properly. "I'm not many people." Kestrel's smile was like sunrise breaking over a battlefield. "No, you are not." Colonel Slade emerged from his office, his face haggard as if he'd aged a decade in the past hour. Behind him came Lieutenant Morrison and a dozen soldiers, their expressions ranging from fury to bewilderment to something that might have been envy. "Magnolia," her father said, his voice hoarse. "Please, don't do this." Maggie looked down at the man who'd raised her, trained her, shaped her into the weapon she'd become. For a moment, she saw past the rigid military bearing to the broken father who'd never properly grieved his wife, who'd poured all his love and fear into making sure his daughter could survive in a world that wanted to destroy everything he cared about. "I love you, Papa," she said softly. "But I need to know who I am when I'm not killing people." She spurred Temperance forward, riding toward the gate where Kestrel and his warriors waited. Behind her, she heard her father's voice crack like a breaking branch. "If they hurt you, I'll burn the entire Tory to find you." Maggie didn't look back. "If they hurt me, there won't be enough left of them for you to burn." The landscape beyond Fort Defiance stretched endlessly in all directions, A rolling sea of grass and sage broken by occasional mesas that rose like sleeping giants from the earth. Maggie had ridden this country countless times, usually hunting. Comanche war parties or escorting supply wagons. But riding beside 20 Comanche warriors, instead of hunting them, felt like entering an entirely different world. They rode in silence for the first hour. The only sounds the rhythmic thunder of hooves on grass and the occasional call of a hawk circling overhead. Maggie found herself studying her companions with new eyes, noting details she'd never bothered to observe when she was trying to kill them. They were younger than she'd expected, most of them barely out of their teens. Their horses were magnificent. Animals smaller than cavalry mounts, but bred for endurance and speed. The warriors themselves moved with their ponies like they'd been born in the saddle, every shift of weight and touch of heel communicating something she couldn't interpret. Kestrel rode beside her, close enough that their stirrups occasionally brushed, but he seemed content with silence. Unlike the white men who'd tried to court her, he didn't feel the need to fill every moment with words, to prove his worth through constant conversation. The silence should have been uncomfortable. Instead, it felt like a gift. They stopped at midday beside a stream that meandered through a grove of cottonwoods, their leaves rustling secrets in the desert wind. The warriors dismounted and began tending their horses with practiced efficiency, while Maggie remained mounted, uncertain of the protocol for dismounting among potential enemies. "You may get down," Kestrel said, amusement flickering in his dark eyes. "We do not bite." "Speak for yourself," one of the younger warriors called out in English. Grinning to show he was joking, Maggie slid from her saddle, her legs stiff from the unfamiliar riding position. These Comanche ponies were smaller than Temperance, requiring a different seat, a different balance. Everything about this journey was forcing her to adjust, to adapt, to question assumptions she'd never realized she was making. "You speak English well," she said to the young warrior who'd made the joke. "I should hope so," he replied, leading his pony to water. "I learned it from my mother. She was white, like you." The casual revelation hit Maggie like a thunderbolt. Died of the spotted sickness 3 winters ago. But she taught me your words before she left for the spirit world. His expression grew serious. She said understanding your enemy's language was the first step to understanding whether they needed to remain your enemy. Maggie stared at him, processing the implications. "You're half white, as are 2 others in our band," Kestrel said, appearing beside them with the silent grace of a hunting cat. "The world is not as simple as your fort would have you believe." "Stormbringer." "Stop calling me that," Maggie said, surprised by her own vehemence. "Why? It is what you are. It's what I've been made into. There's a difference." Kestrel studied her with those unsettling dark eyes. "What would you prefer to be called?" The question caught her completely off guard. For 7 years, she'd been the Stormbringer, the angel of vengeance, the untamable daughter of Fort Defiance. Before that, she'd been Magnolia, the colonel's little girl. But who was she really, underneath all those labels and expectations? "I don't know," she admitted. "Then we will have to discover it together." The village appeared like a mirage on the horizon, a collection of tipis arranged in careful patterns that spoke of ancient traditions and deep understanding of the land. Smoke rose from cook fires, horses grazed in managed herds, and children ran between the lodges with the fearless energy of youth. It looked nothing like the savage encampment Maggie had been taught to expect. "This is impossible," she breathed, reining Temperance to a halt on a ridge overlooking the camp. "What is impossible?" Kestrel asked. "There have to be 300 people down there. Our scouts report Comanche bands of 50 at most." Kestrel's expression grew grim. "Your scouts see what we allow them to see. This is only one of 7 such camps within a day's ride of your fort." The numbers staggered Maggie. 7 camps of 300 people each, over 2,000 Comanche within striking distance of Fort Defiance. when military intelligence suggested no more than a few hundred in the entire territory. Why haven't you attacked? She asked. You could overrun the fort in an hour. Because, Kestrel said quietly, we are not the monsters your people believe us to be. They rode down into the camp, and Maggie felt every eye follow their progress. Women looked up from their work, children stopped their games, warriors emerged from their lodges. But instead of the hostile stares she expected, she saw something that looked suspiciously like curiosity. An elderly woman approached, her hair silver as moonlight, her face mapped with lines that spoke of wisdom earned through suffering. She spoke rapidly to Kestrel in Comanche, her tone sharp with what sounded like maternal scolding. Kestrel responded respectfully, but Maggie caught the edge of defiance in his voice. The exchange continued for several minutes, growing more heated, until the older woman threw up her hands in apparent exasperation and stalked away. My grandmother, Kestrel explained, dismounting. She believes I am making a mistake. What kind of mistake? Bringing a white woman into our camp. Specifically, bringing the Stormbringer into our camp. Maggie felt her cheeks burn. Your reputation precedes you, as does ours. What did you tell her? Kestrel was quiet for a long moment, helping her down from her horse with hands that lingered on her waist longer than strictly necessary. I told her that some mistakes are worth making. Before Maggie could respond, a group of children surrounded them, chattering excitedly in Comanche while staring at her with undisguised fascination. One little girl, no more than 5 or 6, reached out tentatively to touch Maggie's auburn hair. They have never seen hair this color, Kestrel explained. They think it is made of fire. The innocent wonder in the children's eyes hit Maggie harder than any bullet ever had. These were the monsters she'd been taught to kill without mercy. These laughing, curious children who looked at her with such openness. Kestrel, she said quietly, what have we been doing to each other? His expression grew sad and ancient. What people always do when they are afraid and too proud to admit it. We have been destroying each other instead of trying to understand. Kestrel's lodge was larger than the others, befitting his status as war chief, but it was furnished with surprising simplicity. Buffalo robes covered the ground, weapons hung from the lodge poles, and a small fire burned in the center, its smoke rising through the opening at the top. Maggie sat across from him, acutely aware that she was alone with a man who had every reason to hate her, in a place where no one from her world would ever think to look for her. She should have been terrified. Instead, she felt more at peace than she had in years. Tell me about the first man you killed, Kestrel said without preamble. The question was like a knife thrust to the heart. Why? Because I want to understand what made the Stormbringer. Maggie stared into the dancing flames, remembering a day she'd tried to forget for 7 years. I was 16. A Comanche war party raided a homestead 5 miles from the fort. When we arrived, the family was dead except for their daughter, Sarah Mitchell. She was my age, and they'd done things to her before they killed her. Kestrel's face remained impassive, but she saw something flicker in his eyes. We tracked the war party for 3 days, Maggie continued. Found them celebrating around their fire, wearing Sarah's dress, her mother's jewelry. I put a bullet through the war chief's heart from 200 yards. And how did it feel? Like justice. The words tasted like ashes in her mouth. Like I was finally doing something that mattered. Kestrel nodded slowly. And the second man? What? The second man you killed. How did that feel? Maggie was quiet for a long moment. Like ... like duty. And the third? Like ... She stopped, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. Like nothing. It felt like nothing. Yes, Kestrel said softly. That is how a person becomes a weapon. First you kill for justice, then for duty. Then for nothing at all, because killing is what you do. Maggie looked up at him, seeing her own reflection in his dark eyes. How many men have you killed? 43. The specific number shocked her. You keep count? I remember every face. Every name when I knew it. Every family they left behind. Kestrel's voice was quiet as falling snow. That is the difference between a warrior and a killer. A warrior remembers. A killer forgets. Which one am I? That, Kestrel said, is what we are here to discover. He stood and moved to a wooden chest in the corner of the lodge, returning with something wrapped in soft deerskin. He unwrapped it carefully, revealing the most beautiful rifle Maggie had ever seen. The stock was carved with intricate patterns. Inlaid with silver and turquoise, the barrel blued to perfection. This belonged to a white settler named Thomas Mitchell, Kestrel said. Maggie's blood turned to ice. Sarah's father. Yes, it was taken during the raid that killed his family. The raid that made you the Stormbringer. Kestrel held the rifle. Out to her. The warrior who carried this gun died by your hand 3 years ago. His name was Running Wolf, and he had 2 sons and a daughter who loved him. Maggie stared at the weapon, her hands trembling. Why are you telling me this? Because Running Wolf was my brother. The words exploded in the silence of the lodge like thunder. Maggie's hand flew to her gun, but Kestrel made no move to stop her. You brought me here to kill me, she whispered. I brought you here to show you the truth, Kestrel said calmly. Running Wolf was not the monster you believed him to be. He was a man driven to desperate acts by desperate circumstances. Just as you are a woman driven to desperate acts by desperate circumstances, he killed innocent people, as have you. The accusation hung between them like smoke. Maggie wanted to deny it, to rage against the unfairness of his words. But deep in her heart, she knew he was right. How many Comanche warriors had she killed who were guilty of nothing more than defending their families? How many sons and fathers and brothers had fallen to her guns? What do you want from me? She asked. Kestrel set the rifle aside and moved closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes, smell the sage and leather scent that clung to his skin. I want you to stop being the Stormbringer, he said quietly. I want you to remember that you are human. I want you to choose something other than death, and if I can't, then tomorrow when the sun sets, you will ride back to your fort, and we will continue this war until there is nothing left of either of us. Maggie stared at him, feeling the weight of impossible choices crushing down on her shoulders. Outside the lodge, she could hear the sounds of normal life. Children playing, women singing, men talking around fires. It was so ordinary, so peaceful, so completely at odds with everything she'd been taught about these people. Kestrel, she whispered, I don't know how to be anything other than what I am. His hand reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and touched her cheek with surprising gentleness. Then let me teach you. Dawn came like a whisper across the Comanche camp, painting the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold that Maggie had never noticed during her years of sunrise raids and military reveille. She woke in Kestrel's lodge, disoriented and strangely peaceful, wrapped in buffalo robes that smelled of sage and something wild she couldn't name. Kestrel was gone, but the fire still burned low, and she could hear the camp stirring to life. Outside, children's laughter, women's voices calling to each other, the soft whicker of horses greeting the morning. It sounded like ... home. The realization hit her like a physical blow. You slept like the dead. Kestrel's voice came from the lodge entrance, and she turned to see him silhouetted against the morning light, carrying something that made her stomach clench with dread. Her guns, all of them. The Colt .45 that had never left her side, the rifle she'd used to kill 18 Comanche warriors, the knife that had opened more throats than she cared to remember. What are you doing with those? She asked, her voice sharper than she intended. Kestrel set the weapons down carefully, just out of her reach but close enough that she could see them, teaching you your first lesson, which is that you are more than the tools you carry. Maggie stared at the guns, feeling naked without their familiar weight. For 7 years, those weapons had been extensions of her body, sources of power and protection and identity. Without them, who was she? I need those, she said quietly. No, Kestrel replied. You think you need them. There is a difference. He moved closer, settling cross-legged beside the fire with the fluid grace she was beginning to associate with all his movements. Tell me, Magnolia Slade, what did you dream of becoming when you were a child, before the Stormbringer was born? The use of her full name, spoken without mockery or diminishment, startled her. When had anyone last called her Magnolia? When had she last thought of herself as anything other than a weapon with a woman's face? I don't remember, she lied. Kestrel's dark eyes saw straight through her. Try. Maggie wrapped the buffalo robe tighter around her shoulders, staring into the dancing flames. I wanted to be like my mother. She was gentle, kind. She could make flowers grow in the desert, could gentle the wildest horse with just her voice. She saw beauty in everything, even in this harsh land. And she died because of it. Because she was too gentle, too trusting. The world killed her for being soft. So you decided never to be soft again. It wasn't a question, and Maggie didn't bother to answer. Kestrel already knew the truth, that 8-year-old Magnolia had looked at her mother's grave and sworn. An oath that no one would ever call her weak, ever hurt her for being feminine, ever mistake her for easy prey. What if, Kestrel said quietly, your mother died not because she was gentle, but because she was brave? What if kindness is not weakness, but the greatest courage of all? Before Maggie could respond, a commotion outside the lodge drew there. Attention! Voices raised in alarm, horses whinnying, the sound of running feet. Maggie's hand moved instinctively toward her missing gun as Kestrel rose smoothly to investigate. Stay here, he commanded. But Maggie was already on her feet, following him into the morning chaos. That the source of the disturbance became clear immediately. A group of young Comanche warriors had returned to camp, but they weren't alone. Tied across the back of one of their ponies was a white man, unconscious and bleeding from multiple wounds. Maggie recognized him instantly. Private Danny Morrison. Lieutenant Morrison's younger brother, barely 18 and new to the frontier. What was he doing this far from the fort? The crowd that gathered around the returning warriors was agitated, angry voices calling for immediate vengeance. Maggie caught enough words to understand that Danny had been found near one of the outlying camps, armed and apparently scouting. Their positions. Spy, one of the warriors spat in English, clearly for her benefit. White dog sent to count our numbers. Kestrel moved through the crowd with quiet authority, examining the unconscious soldier. When he looked up, his expression was grim. He will live, he announced. But the question is whether he should. The crowd's response was immediate and unanimous. Death. Death for the spy. Death for the enemy. Death as payment for all the wrongs committed by his people. The bloodthirsty roar was exactly what Maggie had expected from Comanche savages, which made Kestrel's next words all the more shocking. No. The single word cut through the chaos like a blade, and the crowd fell silent. Even the camp dogs seemed to sense the tension crackling through the air. This boy is not a warrior, Kestrel continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the gathered crowd. He is a child playing at soldier, sent by men too cowardly to come themselves. Killing him would make us no better than those who butcher women and children. He would kill us without hesitation, shouted one of the young warriors who'd captured Danny. How many of our brothers have fallen to white guns? How many of our women and children have they murdered? Too many, Kestrel agreed. But their evil does not excuse our own. The argument that erupted was fierce and immediate, voices raised in anger and frustration. Maggie found herself caught in the middle of it all, acutely aware that every eye kept flicking toward her, judging her reaction, waiting to see whose side the Stormbringer would take. What would you do, white woman? The voice belonged to the elderly woman who'd scolded Kestrel the day before, his grandmother. Her English was accented but clear, her gaze sharp as obsidian. "This boy came to count our numbers so his people could plan our deaths. In your fort, what would be his fate?" Maggie felt the weight of the question crushing down on her. In her world, Danny Morrison would already be dead. Caught spying on enemy positions, he would have been executed without trial or ceremony. Military justice was swift and brutal, but looking at his pale, unconscious face, she saw not an enemy spy, but a scared boy who'd probably volunteered for this mission to prove himself to his older brother. A boy who reminded her painfully of herself at that age, desperate to be seen as worthy, willing to risk everything for approval. "In my world," she said slowly, "he would be dead already." The crowd murmured approval, but Maggie wasn't finished. "But maybe," she continued, her voice growing stronger, "my world has been wrong about a lot of things." The silence that followed was electric. Kestrel's grandmother studied Maggie with new interest, while the young warriors looked confused and angry. "You would spare him?" one of them demanded. "After all your people have done to ours?" "I would." "Spare him because of all we've done to each other," Maggie replied. "Because maybe it's time someone broke the cycle." They carried Danny Morrison to the medicine lodge, where an ancient Comanche healer named White Dove tended his wounds with herbs and poultices that seemed to work better than anything in Fort Defiance's medical supplies. Maggie found herself assigned as his guard, not to prevent escape, but to keep the more vengeful young warriors from finishing what they'd started. "Why are you helping him?" asked Little Fox, one of the half-white warriors she'd met the day before. He sat across from her in the medicine lodge, cleaning his rifle with methodical precision. "I don't know," Maggie admitted. "Maybe because I'm tired of killing being the answer to everything," Little Fox snorted. Easy words from someone who has never lost a child to white bullets. The accusation stung because it was true. Maggie had never been a mother, never felt that particular kind of love and loss. But she'd been a daughter who lost her mother, and that had to count for something. "You're right," she said quietly. "I don't know that pain. But I know what it feels like to have killing be the only language you speak. And I'm starting to think there might be better ways to communicate, such as..." Before Maggie could answer, Danny Morrison stirred on his bed of buffalo robes, his eyes fluttering open. When he saw where he was, surrounded by armed Comanche warriors in a medicine lodge that reeked of unfamiliar herbs, his face went white with terror. "Easy," Maggie said, moving closer. "You're alive, Private. Try to keep it that way." Danny's eyes focused on her with desperate relief. "Miss Slade, thank God. Have you come to rescue me?" The innocent question hit Maggie like a punch to the gut. Rescue him? From people who were healing his wounds and debating whether mercy was stronger than vengeance? From a chief who'd spared his life when any military court would have ordered his execution? "Nobody's rescuing anybody," she said gently. "We're all just trying to figure out how to stop killing each other long enough to have a conversation." Danny struggled to sit up, wincing at the pain from his wounds. "I don't understand." "You're cooperating with hostiles?" "I'm cooperating with human beings," Maggie corrected. "Same as you are once you get past the paint and feathers. But they're savages. They're murderers and raiders and we're what?" Maggie's voice sharpened. "Civilized? Noble? Tell me, Danny, what were you doing when they found you?" "Taking a nature walk?" Danny's face flushed red. "I was gathering intelligence on enemy positions. It's my duty as a soldier." "Your duty," Little Fox said conversationally, "was to help plan the deaths of our women and children. In my language, we have a word for men who make war on children. It is not a compliment." The simple truth of the statement left Danny speechless. Maggie could see him struggling with concepts that challenged everything he'd been taught, just as she'd been struggling since arriving in this camp. "How many times," she asked Danny quietly, Have you heard officers at the fort refer to a good Comanche? What do you mean? You know what I mean. How many times have you heard someone say the only good Comanche is a dead Comanche? Danny's silence was answer enough. And how many times, Maggie continued, have you wondered if maybe they were wrong? That evening, Kestrel found Maggie sitting beside the creek that ran through the camp, staring at the water as it caught and reflected the last light of day. She'd been thinking about her mother's journal, about the Comanche woman who'd traded beads with a white settler's wife, about all the small moments of human connection that got lost in the larger narrative of war. You saved the boy's life today, Kestrel said, settling beside her on the grass. You saved his life. I just didn't argue for his death. For someone raised to see my people as animals, that was a brave choice. Maggie was quiet for a long moment, listening to the water whisper secrets to the stones. Kestrel, why did you really bring me here? And don't tell me it was to show me the truth about your people. There's something else. Kestrel's expression grew distant, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of old pain. Because I am tired of being what this war has made me. And I thought perhaps you were too. What has it made you? A killer who dreams of building instead of destroying. A war chief who would rather negotiate than fight. A man who looks at his enemy and sees not a monster, but a mirror. The words hung between them like smoke from a dying fire. Maggie turned to study his profile, noting the lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the way his shoulders carried the weight of decisions that had no good outcomes. Your people don't understand you either, she realized. Some do, most fear that. I am too soft for the battles ahead. They look at me and see a chief who brings enemy spies into our camp instead of killing them, who speaks of peace while our children die from white man's diseases. And what do you see when you look at yourself? Kestrel turned to meet her gaze, and in his dark eyes, she saw the same exhaustion and confusion that plagued her own reflection. I see a man who has forgotten how to be anything other than what his people need him to be. Just as you have forgotten how to be anything other than what your people made you. The parallel was so obvious that Maggie wondered how she'd missed it. They were both prisoners of other people's expectations, both trapped by identities forged in blood and maintained through violence. What did you want to be? She asked. Before the war, chief? Kestrel smiled, and for a moment, the exhaustion lifted from his features. A horse trainer. I wanted to breed the finest ponies on the plains, animals that could run like the wind and turn like lightning. I wanted to create something beautiful instead of destroying it. You still could I? When I wake each morning, there are decisions waiting that will determine whether my people live or die. Warriors looking to me for guidance, families depending on my protection. How do I tell them I would rather train horses than plan battles? Maggie understood the trap perfectly. How did you step away from being what everyone needed you to be, even when that identity was slowly killing your soul? Maybe, she said quietly, we're asking the wrong questions. What do you mean? Maybe the question isn't how to stop being what we are. Maybe it's how to become what we were meant to be. They were interrupted by the sound of approaching horses, coming fast and hard from the direction of Fort Defiance. Kestrel was on his feet instantly, his hand moving to his knife, but Maggie recognized the rhythm of the hoofbeats. Cavalry, she said grimly, and they're not coming for a social visit. The riders appeared through the dusk like avenging angels. A patrol of 20 soldiers led by Lieutenant Morrison himself. They thundered into the camp with weapons drawn, horses lathered with sweat and foam from hard riding. The Comanche response was immediate and deadly. Warriors seemed to materialize from the shadows, arrows nocked, rifles ready. In seconds, the camp had transformed from a peaceful village into an armed fortress, and 40 weapons were pointed at 40 targets in a tableau that balanced on the knife's edge of massacre. "Stand down!" Lieutenant Morrison shouted, his voice cracking with strain. "We've come for my brother and Miss Slade." They're under our protection, Kestrel replied calmly, moving to stand between the soldiers and his people. If you came in peace, you would have sent a messenger, not armed men. Morrison's face was flushed with rage and fear. My brother is 18 years old. If you've harmed him, your brother is alive and healing, Maggie said, stepping into the circle of firelight where both sides could see her clearly. No thanks to the intelligence mission you sent him on. Morrison's eyes found her, and she saw relief war with confusion in his expression. Miss Slade, thank God you're alive. We've come to take you home. Home? Maggie looked around the camp, at the children peeking out from behind their mothers' skirts, at the warriors who held death in their hands, but waited for their chiefs. Command at Kestrel, whose eyes never left her face. What if I don't want to come home? The question hit the soldiers like a physical blow. Behind Morrison, she could see Sergeant O'Malley, his weathered face creased with worry and something that might have been understanding. Miss Slade, Morrison said carefully, you've been a prisoner for 2 days. Sometimes captives develop feelings for their captors. It's a known condition. You're not thinking clearly. Maggie's laugh was sharp as broken glass. I'm thinking more clearly than I have in 7 years, Lieutenant. The question is whether you're brave enough to hear what I have to say, Magnolia. Sergeant O'Malley urged his horse forward, his voice gentle. Your father is half mad with worry. He's gathering every available man to march on this camp. If they don't come back with us, ... he'll start a war that will kill hundreds of people, Maggie finished. I know, then come home, Morrison pleaded. End this madness before it begins. Maggie looked at Kestrel, seeing her own reflection in his dark eyes. 2 people caught between worlds, between identities, between the weight of other people's expectations and their own desperate need for something real. What if there was another way? She asked the assembled soldiers. What if instead of ending this with more death, we ended it with something else, such as? O'Malley asked quietly. Maggie took a deep breath, feeling the weight of an impossible decision settling on her shoulders. What she said next would determine not just her own fate, but the fate of everyone in this camp, everyone at Fort Defiance, everyone caught in the grinding machinery of a war that had consumed too many lives already. Such is the truth, she said finally. What if we tried telling each other the truth for once? The silence that followed stretched like a taut rope, ready to snap at the slightest provocation. 20 soldiers faced 40 warriors in a standoff. That could turn into a bloodbath with one wrong word, one nervous trigger finger, one moment of fear overwhelming reason. But it was Danny Morrison who broke the silence, stumbling out of the medicine lodge with White Dove supporting his weight. His face was pale but determined, and when he spoke, his voice carried across the camp like a bell tolling. James, he said to his brother, they saved my life. Lieutenant Morrison's horse pranced nervously as he stared at his younger brother. Danny, are you all right? Have they hurt you? They found me bleeding to death and brought me here to heal, Danny replied, his voice growing stronger. I came here as a spy, James. I came here to gather intelligence so we could plan their deaths. And when they caught me, they chose mercy. The words hit the soldiers like bullets. Maggie could see them struggling to reconcile this reality with everything they'd been taught about Comanche savagery. That's impossible, Morrison said weakly. They're raiders, murderers. They don't show mercy. Neither do we, Danny replied quietly. When have we ever spared a captured Comanche? When have we ever chosen healing over killing? Kestrel stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate, hands visible and empty. Lieutenant Morrison, your brother speaks truth. We could have killed him. Many in our camp wanted to. But we chose to let him live because we are tired of death being our only conversation. This is insane, Morrison muttered, but Maggie could hear the doubt creeping into his voice. Is it? She asked, moving closer to the soldiers. Or is it the first sane thing any of us have done in years? She gestured toward the camp around them, at the families watching this deadly drama unfold. Look around you, Lieutenant. Do you see savage raiders? Or do you see people protecting their children, just like we protect ours? I see hostiles who have taken you prisoner. No, Maggie interrupted, her voice ringing with conviction. You see people who have shown me more humanity in 2 days than I felt in 7 years of war. She turned to address both sides, her voice carrying across the camp. We are all prisoners here. Prisoners of a war that's forgotten what it was fighting for. Prisoners of hate that's become so familiar we can't imagine living without it. Kestrel moved to stand beside her, and she felt the warmth of his presence like sunlight on her skin. The Stormbringer speaks wisdom. We have become what this conflict demanded of us, but we do not have to remain what we have become. Pretty words, one of Morrison's soldiers called out. But words don't bring back the dead. No, Maggie agreed. But they might prevent more death. They might give us a chance to become something other than killers and raiders and soldiers who follow orders without thinking. She looked directly at Lieutenant Morrison, seeing past his uniform to the frightened young man underneath. James, if you take me back to the fort, what happens next? My father will still attack this camp. These people will still defend themselves. More children will be orphaned, more families destroyed. And for what? Because we're too proud to admit. We might have been wrong? Morrison's hand tightened on his rifle. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting we stop this. Right here, right now. I'm suggesting we choose to be human beings instead of weapons. How? Maggie looked at Kestrel, seeing her own desperate hope reflected in his eyes. By telling the truth to people who need to hear it. By going back to the fort together and proving that enemies can choose to become something else. The proposal hit both sides like lightning. Soldiers looked at each other with confusion and fear, while Comanche warriors muttered in their own language, their voices rising in anger and disbelief. You want us to ride into Fort Defiance with Comanche warriors? Morrison asked incredulously. That's suicide. Maybe, Maggie admitted. Or maybe it's the bravest thing any of us will ever do. Kestrel's grandmother pushed through the crowd, her ancient eyes blazing with fury. She spoke rapidly in Comanche, her words clearly a condemnation of the entire insane proposal. But Kestrel responded with quiet dignity, and though Maggie couldn't understand the words, she heard the respect in his tone, the love beneath the disagreement. Finally, the old woman fell silent, studying Maggie with eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul. When she spoke again, it was in English, her voice heavy with the weight of prophecy. You ask our people to trust the White Fort with our war chief's life. You ask them to believe that your words can stop bullets and hatred. Why should we take such a risk for someone who has killed our children? The question hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Maggie felt the weight of every life she'd taken, every family she'd destroyed, every choice that had led her to this moment. Because, she said quietly, I'm asking you to let me try to save more lives than I've taken. And because maybe the only way to stop being the Stormbringer is to become something else entirely. Dawn broke blood red over the Texas plains as the most unlikely procession in frontier history prepared to ride toward Fort Defiance. 12 Comanche warriors, including Kestrel himself, had volunteered for what many considered a suicide mission. 20 cavalry soldiers, led by a deeply reluctant Lieutenant Morrison, would escort them under a flag of truce that had never been tested under such circumstances. And at the center of it all rode Maggie Slade, no longer the Stormbringer, but not yet sure what she was becoming. She carried her weapons again. Kestrel had returned them with a quiet smile that said he trusted her to choose when and how to use them. The weight felt different now, less like extensions of her soul and more like tools she might or might not need. This is madness, Lieutenant Morrison muttered for the 100th time, his face pale beneath his cavalry hat. My father will have me court-martialed for even considering this. Your father will have you shot if we fail, Danny Morrison replied from beside his brother. The younger Morrison had insisted on making the journey, despite his wounds, claiming he owed these people a debt that could only be repaid through witness, but he might just listen if we succeed. Kestrel rode slightly ahead, his war paint replaced by simpler decorations that spoke of diplomacy rather than battle. Behind him, his warriors maintained perfect formation, their faces masks of controlled tension. They knew they were riding into the heart of enemy territory, trusting their lives to the word of a white woman, who had killed more of their people than any other single person. The trust was staggering and terrifying. Regrets? Kestrel asked. Quietly, bringing his horse alongside Temperance, Maggie considered the question seriously. 3 days ago, she had been the untouchable daughter of Fort Defiance, feared and respected and utterly alone. Now she was leading a diplomatic mission that would either make history or end in massacre. Ask me again when we're either shaking hands or bleeding out, she replied. Kestrel's laugh was warm despite the deadly circumstances. You have a warrior's honesty. I respect that. Honesty might be all we have left. As they crested a ridge that brought Fort Defiance into view, the magnitude of what they were attempting hit them all like a physical blow. The fort sat on the horizon like a brown scar against the landscape, its walls bristling with cannon and rifle barrels. Smoke rose from cook fires and forges, and even at this distance, they could see the ant-like movement of soldiers preparing for what they clearly expected to be a battle. Sweet Mary, Sergeant O'Malley breathed. The colonels called up every man within 50 miles. There must be 300 soldiers down there. Indeed, the area around Fort Defiance looked like a military encampment preparing for siege. Tents dotted the landscape, horses filled makeshift corrals, and supply wagons stretched in long lines toward the horizon. Colonel Slade had clearly decided that if his daughter was to be rescued, it would be with overwhelming force. They're expecting a fight, one of the Comanche warriors observed in English. Then we'll have to give them something else, Maggie replied, spurring Temperance forward. The first shots came when they were still half a mile from the fort's gates. Warning shots fired high over their heads, but the message was clear. Come. No closer. The mixed procession of cavalry and Comanche warriors pulled up short, horses dancing nervously as the echoes of gunfire rolled across the plains. Well, Lieutenant Morrison said grimly, at least we know they've seen us. Through his spyglass, Maggie could see soldiers running along the fort's walls, officers shouting orders, cannon being wheeled into position. The flag of truce that Lieutenant Morrison carried meant nothing to men who saw only enemy warriors approaching their stronghold. Maggie! The voice boomed across the distance, amplified by a speaking trumpet. Colonel Slade himself stood on the fort's ramparts, his uniform crisp even at this distance. Ride clear of those hostiles. We have you covered. The assumption that she was still a prisoner, still in need of rescue, would have been laughable, if it weren't so dangerous. Maggie urged Temperance forward, close enough that her voice would carry, but far enough that nervous fingers wouldn't accidentally start a war. Papa, she called back, I'm not a prisoner, I'm an ambassador. The silence that followed was profound. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath as 300 soldiers tried to process what they'd just heard. Then the voices started, angry, confused, disbelieving. Officers barked orders, soldiers raised rifles, and somewhere in the chaos, a bugle began sounding the call to arms. This isn't working, Danny Morrison said urgently. They can't hear reason over their own fear. Kestrel studied the fort's defenses with a warrior's eye. If we retreat now, they will follow. If we advance, they will fire. We are caught between storms, and storms care nothing for flags or good intentions. It was true. They had reached the point where logic and diplomacy meant nothing. where fear and training would take over unless something dramatic shifted the balance. Maggie felt the weight of impossible choices crushing down on her shoulders. Then inspiration struck like lightning. "Give me your rifle," she said to Lieutenant Morrison. "What? Your rifle? And everyone else needs to dismount and lay down their weapons. All of them. Right here, right now." Morrison stared at her as if she'd lost her mind. "That's suicide. The moment we're unarmed, we stop being a threat." Maggie interrupted. "We become people talking to people instead of soldiers facing warriors." She slid from Temperance's saddle and began unbuckling her gun belt, her movements deliberate and visible to every man watching from the fort's walls. Sometimes the only way to prove you're not a threat is to make yourself vulnerable. For a heartbeat that lasted forever, nobody moved. Then Kestrel dismounted with fluid grace and laid his rifle on the ground, followed by his knife, his tomahawk, every weapon he carried. One by one, his warriors followed suit, creating a pile of arms that gleamed in the morning sun. The cavalry soldiers looked to Lieutenant Morrison, who stared at the growing collection of weapons with obvious terror. Finally, his own fear of court-martial outweighing his fear of massacre, he dismounted and added his rifle to the pile. "If this gets us killed," he muttered, "I'm going to haunt you for eternity." "Get in line," Maggie replied. They walked toward Fort Defiance like penitents approaching a shrine. 32 souls trusting their lives to the radical notion that honesty might be stronger than bullets. The distance seemed to stretch endlessly, each step bringing them closer to either breakthrough or bloodbath. Maggie could see individual faces now on the fort's walls, young soldiers who looked terrified, grizzled veterans who looked confused, officers who looked furious. At the center of it all stood Colonel Slade, his spyglass trained on his daughter as she walked beside the war chief who should have been her mortal enemy. "Halt!" The command boomed across the final 100 yards. "Not one step closer." They stopped, standing in the open ground before the fort's gates like actors on history's stage. Maggie could feel hundreds of eyes upon her, hundreds of rifle barrels aimed at hearts and heads, hundreds of trigger fingers waiting for the order to fire. "Papa," she called, her voice carrying clearly in the desert air. "I need to tell you something about Mama." The words hit Colonel Slade like physical blows. Even at this distance, Maggie could see him stagger, could see the spyglass shake in his hands. For 15 years, Catherine Slade's death had been the wound that would not heal, the grief that had transformed a loving father into a man made of military duty and controlled rage. "You don't know what you're talking about," he shouted back. But there was desperation in his voice now, not just anger. Maggie pulled her mother's journal from her saddlebags, holding it high where everyone could see. "I know about the Comanche boy she died protecting. I know about the woman at the trading post who became her friend. I know she didn't die because she was weak. She died because she was the strongest person any of us ever knew." The silence that followed was electric. On the fort's walls, soldiers lowered their rifles slightly, straining to hear. Behind Maggie, she felt Kestrel's presence like an anchor in the storm, steady and strong and unafraid. "She saw them as people, Papa," Maggie continued, her voice breaking with emotion she'd held back for 7 years. "Just like I'm seeing them now. And if she were here, she'd tell you that all this killing, all this hatred, it has to stop." Colonel Slade's response was a roar of anguish that seemed to echo off the mountains themselves. "She's dead because of them. Your mother is dead. Because I couldn't protect her from savage raiders. No." Maggie's voice cut through his pain like a blade. "She's dead because the world taught us to see enemies instead of neighbors. Because we chose fear over understanding. Because good people on both sides have been dying for other people's hatred." She gestured toward Kestrel and his warriors, toward the cavalry soldiers who stood beside them, toward the impossible alliance that had carried them this far. "Look around you, Papa. Look at what we've built in 3 days. Comanche warriors and cavalry soldiers standing together, trusting each other with their lives. If Mama were here, what do you think she'd choose, more war or the chance for peace? The silence stretched like a held breath, and in that silence, Maggie could feel the weight of history balancing on a knife's edge. Everything that happened next would determine not just their fate, but the fate of every family, every child, every dreamer caught in the machinery of frontier warfare. Then Colonel Slade did something that no one expected. He handed his rifle to the soldier beside him and climbed down from the ramparts. The move sent shockwaves through the assembled soldiers. Officers called his name, tried to stop him, demanded he reconsider. But the colonel walked through them like a man in a trance, his eyes fixed on his daughter and the impossible scene she'd created. The fort's gates opened with a grinding of metal and wood, and Colonel Slade emerged alone, walking across the open ground with the measured pace of a man marching toward his own judgment. He stopped 10 feet from the mixed group, close enough to see the truth in their faces, far enough to retreat if necessary. For a long moment, father and daughter stared at each other across a chasm filled with 7 years of grief and rage and misunderstanding. Then Colonel Slade's eyes moved to Kestrel, and Maggie held her breath. "You're the one they call Kestrel who hunts storms," the colonel said quietly. "I am. You've killed my soldiers, as you have killed my warriors." The exchange was simple, honest, devoid of justification or excuse. Two men acknowledging the blood on their hands, the weight of the choices that had brought them to this moment. "And now?" Colonel Slade asked. Kestrel's answer carried the weight of absolute conviction. "Now I stand beside your daughter and ask you to choose what comes next. More death or the chance to write a different ending." Colonel Slade looked at Maggie again, really looked at her, and she saw the moment when he stopped seeing the Stormbringer and started seeing his little girl. Again. The little girl who'd once picked flowers with her mother, who'd dreamed of making the desert bloom, who'd been buried under layers of rage and duty and desperate love. "Magnolia," he said quietly, and the use of her full name was like a benediction. "Are you all right? Really all right?" "I'm better than I've been in 7 years, Papa. I'm remembering who I was before I became what the war made me." Colonel Slade nodded slowly, then did something that made every watching soldier gasp in shock. He extended his hand to Kestrel. "I don't know if this will work," he said simply. "I don't know if my men will follow me, or if your people will trust me. But my daughter is asking me to try something other than killing, and I've been killing for so long I'd forgotten there were other options." Kestrel took the offered hand, and the handshake between enemy commanders sent ripples of amazement through both armies. "It is a beginning," Kestrel said. "Beginnings are often the hardest part." As if his words were a signal, soldiers began emerging. From the fort, slowly at first, then in growing numbers. They came not with weapons but with curiosity, drawn by the impossible sight of their commanding officer, shaking hands with a Comanche war chief. Maggie felt tears streaming down her face as she watched two worlds preparing to meet each other. Not as enemies, but as human beings with shared hopes and fears and dreams. The war wasn't over. There would be setbacks, misunderstandings, people on both sides who would resist change with violence. But something fundamental had shifted in this moment, something that could never be taken back. 3 weeks had passed since the impossible handshake that stopped a war, and Fort Defiance had become something unprecedented in frontier history, a place where Comanche and cavalry shared the same ground without bloodshed. The transformation wasn't complete, wasn't easy, and certainly wasn't accepted by everyone. But it was real. Maggie stood on the fort's ramparts at sunset, watching the most extraordinary sight she'd ever witnessed. Below in the parade ground, Comanche children played with soldiers' children, their laughter mixing in the desert air like music. Kestrel's warriors had set up a temporary camp just outside the fort's walls, close enough for protection, far enough to maintain their independence. Hard to believe, isn't it? Sergeant O'Malley's voice came from behind her, and she turned to see the grizzled Irishman approaching with 2 cups of coffee. 3 weeks ago, those same children would have been hiding from each other. Now they're arguing over marbles like they've been friends their whole lives. Maggie accepted the coffee gratefully, warming her hands on the tin cup. Children adapt faster than adults. They haven't learned to hate yet. But they learn fast when we teach them. O'Malley leaned against the rampart wall, his weathered face thoughtful. The question is what we're teaching them now. It was a fair question. The peace was fragile as spun glass, held together by the mutual respect between Colonel Slade and Kestrel, and by Maggie's position as a bridge between 2 worlds. But bridges could be burned, respect could be shattered, and not everyone on either side was happy with the new arrangement. There's been talk, O'Malley continued quietly. Some of the officers think the colonel's lost his mind. They're saying he's been bewitched by his daughters. Association with the Comanche chief. Maggie's hand tightened on her coffee cup. She'd felt the stares, heard the whispered conversations that stopped when she entered a room. The respect she'd once commanded as the Stormbringer had been replaced by something more complex: fascination, confusion, and in some quarters, outright hostility. What kind of talk? The kind that gets men transferred to Washington for consultations with superior officers. Word is there's already been inquiries about the colonel's fitness for command. The implications hit Maggie like cold water. If her father was removed from command, if someone less sympathetic took his place, this fragile peace would shatter overnight. All the progress they'd made, all the trust they'd built, would be destroyed by men who saw only the old certainties of war. How long do we have? Hard to say. Could be weeks, could be months. Depends on how loud the complaints get and whether Washington decides to listen. Maggie stared down at the mixed camp, watching Kestrel emerge from his lodge to check on the horses. Even at this distance, she could feel the invisible thread that connected them, the understanding that had grown between them like something alive and necessary. 3 weeks of stolen conversations, of learning each other's languages both spoken and unspoken. 3 weeks of discovering that the man she'd been taught to hate was also the man who could make her laugh with a single raised eyebrow, who listened to her thoughts as if they mattered, who looked at her not as the Stormbringer or the colonel's daughter, but as simply Maggie. "Sergeant," she said quietly, "what would you do if you knew the world was about to end everything you'd built?" O'Malley studied her with eyes that had seen too much history to be surprised by human folly. "I'd fight for it, lass. And if fighting didn't work, I'd find another way to protect what mattered most." The council meeting that evening brought together the strangest assembly in frontier history. Colonel Slade sat at one end of the long table in his office, while Kestrel occupied the opposite end. Between them sat officers and warriors, interpreters and medicine men, all trying to navigate the delicate diplomacy of making peace work in practical terms. The discussion had been going for hours, covering everything from grazing rights to trade agreements, from territorial boundaries to the complex question of jurisdiction when crimes occurred between peoples. It was exhausting, necessary work, and Maggie could see the strain wearing on everyone involved. "The problem," Lieutenant Morrison was saying, consulting a map spread across the table, "is that Washington will never officially recognize any treaty that grants permanent territorial rights to hostile tribes." "We are no longer hostile," replied Whitefeather, one of Kestrel's senior warriors. "But we will become hostile again if our rights are not respected." Colonel Slade rubbed his temples, looking older than his 53 years. "The Army follows orders from Washington. I can delay, I can argue, I can request clarification. But eventually, I'll be forced to enforce federal policy, regardless of local agreements." The room fell silent as the fundamental problem crystallized. No matter how successful their local peace might be, it existed in defiance of larger political realities that neither side could control. They were building a castle of sand while the tide of federal policy swept inexorably toward them. Then we need to change the larger realities, Maggie said quietly. Every eye in the room turned to her. She'd been silent for most of the meeting. Listening, learning, trying to understand the impossible complexity of making peace work in a world designed for war. What do you mean? Her father asked. Maggie stood up, moving to the window that overlooked the mixed camp. We need to show Washington and the territorial government that peace isn't just possible, it's profitable. More profitable than war. How? Kestrel asked. His dark eyes fixed on her with the intensity she'd come to know meant he was seeing possibilities others missed. Maggie turned back to the room, feeling the weight of an idea that was either brilliant or insane. By getting married. The silence that followed was so complete that she could hear the wind whistling through gaps in the window frame. Then everyone started talking at once, officers sputtering with outrage, warriors speaking rapidly in Comanche, her father rising from his chair with a face like thunder. Absolutely not. Colonel Slade's voice cut through the chaos. I will not allow my daughter to be sacrificed on the altar of political expedience. It's not sacrifice, Papa, Maggie said calmly. It's choice, my choice. She looked directly at Kestrel, whose expression had gone completely unreadable. A marriage between a white woman and a Comanche chief would create legal complications that Washington couldn't ignore. It would force them to deal with us as individuals, not just as representatives of opposing forces. It would create a scandal, Lieutenant Morrison said weakly. Good, Maggie replied. Scandals get attention. Attention brings scrutiny. Scrutiny forces politicians to make decisions instead of just following old policies. One of the Comanche elders spoke rapidly to Kestrel, his tone clearly incredulous. Kestrel responded in their language, but his eyes never left Maggie's face. My people ask, he said finally, whether you understand what you are proposing. Marriage between our peoples is not just a joining of two individuals. It creates obligations, connections, responsibilities that extend to entire clans. I understand, Maggie said, though her heart was hammering so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. Do you? The question hung between them like smoke from a signal fire. Everyone in the room seemed to hold their breath, waiting for the answer that would either advance their impossible peace or destroy it entirely. Kestrel stood slowly, moving around the table until he stood directly in front of her. Up close, she could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes, smell the sage and leather scent that clung to his skin, feel the warmth radiating from his body. Maggie Slade, he said formally, are you asking me to marry you? The question was so absurd, so backwards from every convention of courtship and proposal, that Maggie almost laughed, almost, but the weight of history in the room, the knowledge that her answer would determine the fate of everything they'd built, kept her serious. I'm asking if you think love might be stronger than politics, she said quietly. Kestrel's smile was like sunrise breaking over a battlefield. In that case, he said, reaching for her hands, yes. The single word set off an explosion of reactions. Colonel Slade began pacing like a caged wolf, muttering about court-martials and congressional inquiries. The officers looked like they'd swallowed live rattlesnakes, while the Comanche warriors spoke rapidly among themselves in tones that ranged from amazement to approval. This is madness, Lieutenant Morrison said for what seemed like the 100th time in recent weeks. An interracial marriage on the frontier? The newspapers will crucify you both. Let them, Maggie replied, her hands still clasped in Kestrel's strong grip. Sometimes madness is the only sane response to an insane situation. Her father stopped pacing and turned to face them, his expression cycling through anger, fear, and something that might have been pride. Magnolia, do you have any idea what you're proposing to endure? The social ostracism, the legal complications, the political consequences? I know what I'm proposing to build, she replied. A family that spans two worlds. Children who will never have to choose between their heritage and their future. A future where the color of someone's skin matters less than the content of their character. Kestrel squeezed her hands gently. And I know what I am choosing to protect. Not just a woman, but an idea. The idea that enemies can become allies, that understanding can triumph over ignorance, that love can be stronger than the forces that try to divide us. White Feather spoke up from his seat at the table. Among our people, marriage is not just a personal choice. It is a political alliance, a joining of families and clans. If our war chief marries into the white world, it creates obligations on both sides. What kind of obligations? Colonel Slade asked warily. Protection, Kestrel replied simply. If Maggie becomes my wife, she becomes family to every Comanche warrior. Any harm done to her would be considered an act of war against our entire people. And if harm comes to Kestrel? Maggie asked. Then it comes to me as well, she continued before anyone could answer. That's what marriage means, shared joy, shared sorrow, shared responsibility for each other's safety and happiness. The room fell quiet again as everyone contemplated the implications. A marriage between Maggie and Kestrel wouldn't just be a romantic union, it would be a living treaty, a human bridge between two peoples who had been killing each other for generations. The timing couldn't be worse, Sergeant O'Malley observed. With Washington already questioning the colonel's judgment, this will give his enemies all the ammunition they need. Or, Maggie countered, it will give us the legitimacy we need to make our case directly to the territorial governor, maybe even to Congress itself. A white woman who chooses to marry a Comanche chief isn't a victim, she's a statement. Colonel Slade sank heavily into his chair, suddenly looking every one of his years. And what statement would that be? Maggie moved to her father's side, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. That love doesn't recognize the boundaries we draw on maps. That peace is possible when people choose to see each other's humanity instead of each other's differences. That maybe, just maybe, your daughter learned something valuable from the mother she lost. The mention of Catherine Slade hit the colonel like a physical blow. For a moment, his military composure cracked, and Maggie saw the grieving widower who still missed his wife with every breath. Your mother, he said quietly, would have loved this impossible plan of yours. She always believed that understanding was possible, even when I couldn't see it. Then help us make it work, Papa. Help us prove that her death wasn't meaningless. That something beautiful can grow from the soil of all this grief. Before Colonel Slade could respond, the office door burst open without ceremony. Major Bradford Cunningham, the fort's second-in-command, strode in with his face flushed and his uniform disheveled, followed by a half-dozen officers who looked equally agitated. Colonel Slade, Cunningham said without preamble, I'm afraid I have to interrupt this meeting. The way he said meeting made it clear he had other words in mind. Behind him, the officers arranged themselves like a tribunal, their expressions ranging from disapproval to outright hostility. Major Cunningham, Colonel Slade said coldly, you were not invited to this council. No, sir, I was not. But as your second-in-command, I have a duty to inform you that word of these proceedings has reached certain parties who are concerned about the direction of our recent policies. Kestrel's hand moved subtly toward his knife, but Maggie caught his wrist, shaking her head slightly. This was a different kind of battle, one that would be won or lost with words rather than weapons. What parties? Colonel Slade asked. Cunningham produced a telegram from his coat pocket, holding it like evidence in a trial. Territorial Governor Harrison has received reports of unauthorized negotiations with hostile tribes. He's demanding a full explanation and has already dispatched Colonel Marcus Webb to conduct an official investigation. The name hit the room like a bomb. Marcus Webb was known throughout the territory as an Indian fighter of the old school, a man who believed the only solution to the Indian problem was complete subjugation or extermination. His appointment as investigator was effectively a death sentence for their peace efforts. "When does Webb arrive?" Colonel Slade asked, his voice carefully controlled. "Tomorrow morning, sir, with a full company of cavalry and explicit orders to restore proper military discipline to Fort Defiance." Maggie felt the walls closing in around them. Everything they'd built, everything they'd sacrificed for, was about to be torn down by men who preferred the simple certainties of warfare to tofa, the complex realities of peace. "Then we have tonight," she said quietly. "Tonight for what?" Cunningham demanded. Maggie looked at Kestrel, seeing her own determination reflected in his dark eyes. "Tonight to get married." The declaration sent shockwaves through the assembled officers. Cunningham's face went purple with outrage, while several of his supporters began speaking at once, their voices raised in protest and disbelief. "You cannot be serious," Cunningham sputtered. "A white woman marrying a savage? It's unnatural, unholy, a violation of every decent Major Cunningham." Colonel Slade's voice cut through the tirade like a saber stroke. "You will remember that you are speaking about my daughter." The quiet authority in his tone stopped Cunningham cold. For all his bluster and political connections, he was still subordinate to Colonel Slade, and open insubordination would be a court-martial offense. "Sir," Cunningham said more carefully, "surely you cannot approve of this madness." Colonel Slade stood slowly, moving to stand beside Maggie and Kestrel. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute conviction. "Major, 3 weeks ago, my daughter prevented a massacre that would have killed hundreds of people on both sides. She chose diplomacy over destruction, understanding over ignorance, love over hatred. If approving of that makes me mad, then I'll wear madness like a badge of honor." He turned to face Maggie and Kestrel, his expression softening. "If you're determined to do this thing, then you have my blessing. And my protection for whatever that's worth." The ceremony took place at midnight, beneath a canopy of desert stars, witnessed by the most unlikely congregation in frontier history. Comanche elders sat beside cavalry officers, children from both cultures held flickering candles, and even Major Cunningham's opposition faction watched from the shadows, their protests silenced by the sheer audacity of what they were witnessing. Maggie wore her mother's wedding dress, altered hastily by the fort's seamstress, and decorated with Comanche beadwork gifted by Kestrel's grandmother. The old woman had approached her at sunset, with tears in her ancient eyes, speaking words in Comanche that needed no translation. Kestrel stood magnificent in traditional war chief regalia mixed with cavalry dress uniform elements, a living symbol of two worlds becoming one. When he took Maggie's hands, his voice carried across the assembled crowd with absolute conviction. "I take you not as conquest, but as partner. Not as possession, but as equal. Together we will build something new from the ashes of old hatred." Maggie's response was equally powerful. "I choose you not despite our differences, but because of them. Together we are stronger than either could be alone." The vows were witnessed under both Comanche spiritual law and territorial civil authority, creating a marriage that existed in two legal systems simultaneously. As they exchanged rings, his carved from turquoise and silver, hers from gold and sacred stone, even their enemies seemed moved by the impossible beauty of the moment. Then the horizon erupted with dust clouds and bugle calls. Colonel Webb had arrived 12 hours early. By order of Territorial Governor Harrison, Webb's voice boomed across Fort Defiance as his cavalry thundered through the gates. "This illegal assembly is hereby disbanded. Colonel Slade, you are relieved of command pending formal investigation." Webb himself was everything Maggie had expected. A career soldier whose weathered face showed no mercy, whose eyes held the cold certainty of a man who'd never questioned an order or considered an alternative to violence. Behind him rode 50 fresh cavalry troops, all armed and clearly prepared for resistance. But instead of the chaos Webb expected, he found something that stopped him cold: Colonel Slade and Chief Kestrel standing side by side, with Maggie between them wearing both a wedding dress and a Comanche ceremonial sash. "Colonel Webb," Slade said formally, "allow me to present my daughter, Mrs. Magnolia Kestrel, who hunts storms, and her husband, Chief Kestrel of the Antelope Band." The formal introduction hit Webb like a physical blow. Marriage changed everything. Legally, a married woman had different legal standing, and a marriage between a white citizen and a tribal chief created unprecedented jurisdictional complications. "This is impossible," Webb sputtered. "Interracial marriage violates territorial statute." "Actually," Maggie interrupted, producing a document from her dress, "territorial statute prohibits marriage between whites and Indians under federal jurisdiction." Chief Kestrel renounced federal jurisdiction when he signed our peace treaty as an independent sovereign. Legally, he's now a foreign dignitary. The legal maneuvering was brilliant and completely unexpected. Webb found himself facing not just a scandal, but a diplomatic incident that could reach all the way to Washington. What happened next would be told around frontier campfires for generations. Instead of ordering his troops to attack, instead of arresting the conspirators, Colonel Webb did something no one anticipated. He dismounted his horse and walked directly to Kestrel. "Chief," he said formally, "I've been sent to restore order to this territory. But looking at what you've built here, I have to ask, what exactly needs ordering?" Around them, the mixed community that had grown up around Fort Defiance provided its own answer. Comanche and cavalry children playing together, warriors and soldiers sharing evening fires, families from both cultures learning each other's languages and customs. "Colonel Webb," Kestrel replied with dignity, "we have chosen to end a war that served no one except those who profit from hatred. If that threatens order, perhaps the order itself was the problem." Webb studied the scene for long minutes, his trained military eye taking in details that political reports had missed. He saw prosperity instead of conflict, cooperation instead of chaos, hope instead of the grinding desperation that usually marked frontier settlements. Finally, he turned to his adjutant. "Send a message to Governor Harrison. Tell him that Fort Defiance represents the most successful peace initiative in territorial history, and that any disruption of current arrangements would likely restart hostilities across the entire region." 5 years later, the settlement that grew around Fort Defiance had become something unprecedented in American history. A truly integrated community where racial boundaries meant less than shared values and mutual respect. Maggie and Kestrel's children played in streets where 3 languages were spoken fluently, where Comanche medicine mixed with frontier practicality, where former enemies had become family. The woman, once called too fierce to love, had discovered that love itself was the fiercest force of all, stronger than hatred, more persistent than politics, more transformative than any weapon ever forged. And in the end, that was the truth that changed everything. Love didn't tame Maggie Slade. Love set her free to become exactly who she was always meant to be. The Stormbringer had become the peacemaker, and the frontier would never be the same.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.